Saunders, a brief introduction for you, Jono. He'll discuss damaged Australian landscapes and their capacity to recover, focusing mostly on the Cumberland Plain, but with examples from elsewhere. He'll talk about vegetation restoration, weed management, and provision of fauna habitat with examples. Some of Jono's background is he was trained as a biologist, specialising in zoology and plant ecology, has a long and varied career in national parks, including nominating sites for the Register of the National Estate as a ranger, team manager for Western Zone, and area manager of Cumberland area, based at Skyville National Park, where he worked on the restoration and management of the Cumberland Plain reserves. This involved well over 15 years of adaptive management and research into weed control, fire management, and encouraging regeneration and recolonisation by fauna. As well as that, Jono has been a farmer on various occasions over the years. So he's got a very eclectic bunch of experience to give to you tonight. So with that brief introduction, I'll hand it over to Jono.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I've got a lot of ground to cover, and I've got a fair number of slides, but I'm going to go through some slides just pretty quickly, just to introduce an idea, and a few things I'll talk about in a bit more detail. If you think I'm going too fast or you find yourself falling asleep, let me know. Okay, so I'm no longer work with national parks, and I'm sorry I didn't have time to take the heading off these slides. But I'm not representing national parks tonight, and I'm not speaking on their behalf. However, a lot of this work was done when I was with national parks. That's a piece of typical Cumberland Plain woodland, and we call it woodland because it looks like woodland rather than forest. And we think of that as being a reasonably good stand. That is a stand that is very much in recovery. That's a stand that was a paddock in probably about 1950. So it's, let me just make sure I've got this going. Slideshow, share the screen. Slideshow start. Share the screen. You might have to do that for me. Okay, this is what a lot of the Cumberland Plain vegetation looks like, because it has been abused probably more than any other piece of vegetation, apart from the stuff that's under the bricks and mortar of Sydney. So 200 years of damage, and I now work for Burrawang Environmental Services. Okay, this is a picture of what early painters who had real problems representing things accurately anyway, because they were used to very different landscapes and so on. But it was very much an active, managed landscape, and there's been massive changes. And it's really difficult for us to actually understand what the Cumberland Plain looked like. So if we start talking about restoring it, it's very difficult for us to understand what we're restoring it to. And that's the case for a lot of Australia. Okay, we know that the landscape was actively managed by Aboriginal people. We know that, contrary to some of the stuff that's said, I, as an ecologist, do not believe that every single piece of Australia was very intensively managed by Aboriginal people. But certainly there were areas, and particularly probably grassy woodlands, that were managed pretty actively. Around places like Royal and Ku-ring-gai, the swamps, the upland swamps, were managed pretty actively. But we don't know about their management. Some communities have been almost totally lost. So the river flats around Windsor was once rainforest, lowland rainforest, and tall eucalypt forest. And there's still some bits of tall eucalypt forest left, but there's no conception of that. So around Windsor and so on, you probably had a picture pretty much like this. This is actually the Richmond River early on, but lowland rainforest along the river. And there's still occasional trees that you find of that, and really big trees. And again, that's not something we see. And early Windsor, again, I've got a North Coast example, but early Windsor from the description was something like this. There was basically a massive timber trade going. Some of the early settlers, sorry, I'm moving out of the Zoom bit. Some of the early settlers actually sent teams of convicts up the Hawkesbury River to cut red cedar and export it before there was any settlement there. And there was large amounts came out of there. So it's hard to picture what the original condition was like. You look at that and you say, oh, that's a flat grassland. That was actually a tall, highly productive, tall forest and rainforest. And we know from early pictures that the trees were really big, the scale and size of that tree. Think back to that first picture I had. The tree was something like about that tall, right? So really, really big trees. And not only were the trees really important, but the Aborigines in Western Sydney, the Darug, actually spent a huge amount of time eating arboreal mammals. Not kangaroos, a little bit of fishing, but arboreal mammals was like a really big staple protein source for them. And that's because there were lots of trees on fertile ground. So there's some clues still in the landscape. That's a tree at Skyville, which is most of the rest of Skyville vegetation come to about there. So that tree would have been there when Captain Cook came to Eastern Australia. And that tree would have too. That's another tree in Skyville. Skyville's about 1,000 hectares. There would be 5 trees in Skyville that have been there since Europeans arrived. Everything else is regrowth. And that's the case over most of the Cumberland Plain. And in Gulgura Nature Reserve down near Bents Basin, gives you an idea of this. That's actually a stump rather than the tree. Gives you an idea of the size of trees that actually grew there. Okay, so there's been a reconstruction of the vegetation done by National Parks. The big thing is that you have sort of sandstone escarpment stuff around here with shale, escarpment stuff around the edge, shale, and then this, all the orangey beigey stuff in the middle is the Cumberland Plain shale, and all of this stuff, I should use this because I can't reach. All of this stuff up here is riverbed sediments. So this is actually stuff that was deposited by ancient rivers. And in fact, there's reasonable evidence, geomorphic evidence, that South Creek is an earlier version, Eastern Creek is an earlier version of South Creek, which is an earlier version of the Hawkesbury River. So there's been a progressive movement of the actual main drainage across. And that's what was left around 2005. And you can see, and this is not a complete picture, but this is a picture of the remnants of trees that was intact enough that they could be mapped. But there are obviously lots of scattered trees around that haven't been mapped in that. But you can see that's the old river deposits, so gravels and sands and so on. So that wasn't very attractive when it came to early settlement, couldn't grow crops in it, so it survived a lot longer. So ecology's been affected in many ways. Direct impacts, so clearing. Indirect impacts, so fire regime changes. Lots of cumulative impacts, different impacts on top of each other. Lots of timescale effects. So a lot of the things that have been affected take a long time to come back. And we need to think about how does the existing ecology work, but how will the possible future ecology work? And that's a lot more complex than just saying, oh, we'll just try and deal with the weeds or whatever. So you actually have to think about the next century and more, because the whole point about it is that a lot of the features in the Cumberland Plain when we arrived and started destroying it were features that were 600 or 700 years old. Those trees that I was showing you were probably not far short from that size 200 years ago. So they're probably somewhere around 400 or 500 years. I don't have dates on them, but just judging from other similar trees that have been aged. Okay, is it possible to recover? So it's easy to sink into a bit of a slough of despond or slough of despond. But the point about it is the Australian biodiversity has been in this landscape for a very, very, very long time. It's not something we as Europeans are used to. The European landscape, most of the European landscape is 15,000 years old. The same with the large amounts of North America and Northern Asia. So the vegetation that our culture has grown up with is a very, very young and still maturing vegetation. This is stuff that's been around here for well over 100 million years. Now, in that time, the vegetation's been through 1 in 100,000 year droughts, 1 in 250,000 year fire events, right? So it's been through these massive and huge floods. So it's been through these massive perturbations. And the stuff that's on the Cumberland Plain is the stuff that survived all of that. So it has potentially an incredible resilience. That's why it's there. Okay, this is the ADI site. That's now a suburb, but you can see the remnant vegetation around here and all the way through there and so on. And that's South Creek coming through there and Ropes Creek coming through there. And when the federal government or the Australian Defence Industries decided they want to develop it, there was a lot of toing and froing about the value of these bits and so on. And after a long fight, that bit was added into the reserve system. Okay. But if you decided you were going to set up a reserve in 1945, then there's nothing there. Why would you do that, right? And in fact, a lot of what we're looking at in the Cumberland Plain is in that condition. And a lot of our decisions about what we think we should be preserving is based upon thinking we've got to find something like that. But something like that has come out of this. This was wheat fields. Governor King had a wheat farm here. Okay? So it's massive changes are possible, but you can't change back from this. Okay, so what are the injuries that have actually happened in real sense? So it's been sustained disturbance. There's vegetation types that are missing. The tall eucalypt forest along creek flats, river flats and creek lines, mostly gone. Some common species are rare. So Eucalyptus salata, river peppermint. There's a little bit of it downstream of Windsor. There's a bit of it upstream of Windsor. There's a couple of trees I found in ADI. That would have been all the way along the river. But it's a great timber tree. And it doesn't regenerate easily because it has massive seed spills some years. And if you cut it in a year when it doesn't have a whole lot of seed, then that's it. You've wiped it out. And then also common species, Antechinus, Rattus fuscipes, which is the thing that if you're a zoology student, that's where you find all the time. It's absent. Lilies, orchids, yams, they're all very palatable for stock. So if you have stock on there all the time, bang, every time they come up, they get eaten. And all of the vegetation, just about, is in a state of regrowth from repeated clearing and logging and grazing. It's not just it's been logged once, it's been logged many times. Okay, and then also maybe major changes to wetlands and watercourses. So in the mid-2000s, we were successful within national parks in getting a bit of hard-won resources to do surveys through the Cumberland Plain Reserves for fauna. Dr. Tanya Leary did that, which was great. There's a bunch of environmental issues. There's a lot of people see different things in the Cumberland Plain. Quite often, a nature reserve also happens to be the local park for a really big suburb, which has been put in there And the developers and the council have gone, oh, well, there's all this bushland here. Everyone can play in the bushland. But that's what they want to play on. So there's major issues in terms of how the parks are valued and taken care of. So I'm going to talk around about a number of issues and take you through a journey about trying to do rehabilitation. So it starts with fire management. Basically, the fire management for the Cumberland Plain came out of sandstone. And the sandstone, it's a reasonably safe thing to say you want to have no more than about 7 or more years between fires. So similar to, you guys would be familiar with it. Okay, all the Cumberland reserves were recent additions. So that's what we were looking at, excluding fire, keeping fire. When you actually look at it, a lot of the vegetation is locked up. So huge number of young trees, and they get to this stage and they stop. And they stop because there's no more room for the trees to get bigger. And the only way they can get bigger is if some of the smaller trees die and then some of the bigger trees have more room to actually spread out. So in the absence of fire and the absence of mortality from that sort of stuff, then you just basically get this stand that's stuck like that. And we'll go on calling it woodland forever because that's what it'll look like. Bursaria, really dense stands of Bursaria, which doesn't like fire. And it has tiny leaves and it actually makes the vegetation fireproof because it doesn't make litter. So you can burn Bursaria, and on a really extreme hot fire day, that'll burn like nobody's business. But it's really hard doing a hazard reduction in it. You've actually got to do a hazard reduction under conditions where in the sandstone you'd say, no way, we're not lighting a thing. So we looked at what are the effects of fire on the Cumberland Plain woodland. And what we actually also looked at was the former agricultural land that once had Cumberland Plain woodland on it, and saw if we use fire, would we be able to benefit the native species? This is African lovegrass, and it looks like 100% African lovegrass, but actually there's a bunch of other species, and particularly native species, in very low numbers underneath that canopy, which is effectively a 30-centimetre high rainforest canopy. It's shading everything pretty much. So we wanted to find out, could we get the species coming back? Now, revegetation. Planting trees is a great thing, and I'm going to talk about what it doesn't do now, but don't mistake me for thinking that planting trees is not an excellent thing to do. However, in Western Sydney Regional Park, there was a lot of tree planting went on from an early stage when it was Department of Planning land. And that's pasture, that's young replantings, that's old revegetation. And the revegetation is just about all just trees, maybe a few wattles, but it's not ground cover. And then that is the reference sites, which is actually extant Cumberland Plain woodland. So the remnant targets there, you want the trees, you want this revegetation to turn into that. And in fact, what happens is the trajectory is like that. So it's not actually getting to there. So you can plant trees, it improves it, but you don't get Cumberland Plain vegetation coming back miraculously. And so you get a state and transition model, this is called. Pretty simply, the T is a point where the vegetation goes through a transition. So you have pasture, you do a transition by planting. So that gives you the state of pasture and plantings. Then you get a certain number of plants, native plants from around that block that will come in, returnees. So there's a transition there of recolonisation. And then that's the remnant, and there's the transition to the remnant just doesn't happen. So there's barriers, and that's what the B is. So there's a bunch of barriers that you can hypothesize stand in the way of that vegetation going back to the original thing. And the fourth transition is just clearing back to pasture. So we did a bunch of, we did some pretty full-on experiments. Just put very simply, that's former orchards, that's former grazed areas, and that's former ploughed areas. And then that's our reference Cumberland Plain woodland. And what we did was we burnt blocks and left other blocks unburnt and monitored what happened over time. And we did a pre-fire survey, we did a fire in all the burn plots, we did a post-fire survey, and then 3 years later we did another pre-fire survey, another burn, and a post-fire survey. Okay, now I've got to remember what it shows. Okay, burnt and unburnt. These are the burnt blocks, unburnt blocks, and the number of native species, that is the Cumberland Plain woodland, and these are the disturbed areas. And basically the number of native species is dropping a bit across the whole thing, but no change, okay? But in the burnt blocks, after the first burn, the number of native species actually increases in the burnt blocks. And then after the second burn, the number of native species increases again, or again gets a boost. So the fire is helping the native species come back. Okay. And you can see in terms of the number of native species on the grassy blocks, you can see that it actually, there's actually, once you've had the fire, then there's significantly more natives on the burnt versus unburnt, and that's significant stay. So blocks that have been burnt have significantly more natives than the unburnt blocks. However, exotic species are also affected, and in fact, after the burn, the number of exotic species also increases. But after the second burn, and that arrow's in the wrong place, should be here, after the second burn, the actual number of exotic species dropped. So the exotic species, when you burnt, you got rid of all that African lovegrass. So suddenly there's a whole lot of sunshine, there's a whole lot of soil and so on. So there's a bunch of those weedy species that went, you beauty, here we are. But if you then burnt again, those species weren't used to being burnt a couple of times, and they went, whoa, we can't take this. And they actually dropped right back. Okay, so there is some sort of benefit to the burning, but the native species dropped over the series over the time of the fire. And in fact, what had happened was when we started the experiment, it was wetter than when we finished. And so in fact, the number of species on all of those blocks declined with rainfall. So when you plot the number of species with the rainfall, then as rainfall decreases, the number of species decreases, and as rainfall increases, you'd expect the number of species to go back up. So it is a real issue in terms of managing the Cumberland Plain and in terms of actually knowing what's out there in the Cumberland Plain, because a lot of the species are basically not rainfall dependent, but very much rainfall correlated. Okay, now then other similar grassland things have figured out that there's one of the things is that the soils have changed, and the exotic species have a different relationship with the soils to the natives. And there's a whole lot of microbes, there's a biome, there's all the fungi that live in the soil that have relationships with a whole bunch of the native plants. And when you have a whole lot of exotic plants, there is different processes going on in the soil. Okay, so one of the things that you look at is, can you restore some of that soil function? And one of the things that has been looked at is adding sugar or adding mulch, adding carbon to the soil. And adding carbon to the soil, most of the exotic species have a low carbon, high nitrogen leaf, right? So the plants themselves have a lot of nitrogen, not much carbon. So when they fall over, they put a lot of nitrogen in the soil and hardly any carbon, which means that the native biome, the native microbes, have nothing to feed on. So there was some work done in Australian White Box, which said this might be a good idea. So we looked at, can we add carbon? And we used sugar, a kilogram of sugar per square metre. And yeah, we had a pallet of sugar, and then we also looked at fire. So did a treatment with fire, and then on some blocks we added sugar. Okay. And that's the control. The exotic sward of grass came back pretty well. That's the sugar addition. So basically the weeds didn't do nearly as well when carbon was added to the mix. And when you look at, so decreased exotic biomass. And so see, this was significant. So you can see that's the control. That's the one with sugar. That's the one with fire, but sugar and fire. So fire helps in knocking out the exotics, but sugar and fire also knocked out the exotics really well. And soil nitrate, so that's where sugar was added. And the soil nitrate came down, and in the ones where sugar was added, where there was excess or more carbon back in the soil, soil nitrate stayed low. Whereas when you didn't do that, because there's a seasonal effect of nitrate, it tends to get lower in winter. The ones that didn't have carbon added, the nitrate comes back up. So that's the stuff that the exotics like, and the natives don't. So you actually give the natives an advantage. It's particularly with these two, particularly those two species. And the native grasses are unaffected, but the issue is there's a plant called African love grass, which was also unaffected. Okay, so the thing is, some weeds are ecological transformers. So they actually, when they come into a place, they change the place so much that it's really hard to get back from there. This is Mount Annan, okay? That's Mount Annan in, I think, probably about 1973, 74. That's Mount Annan. And that's the olives. So they just transform the landscape, and they're changing the soil, they're changing the little layer, they're changing the flammability. Okay, and African lovegrass is also an ecological transformer. So we looked at, can we actually do something to change the African lovegrass? Can we remove it from the system by doing an integrated process that used fire and herbicide? So this is one of our experimental designs, and the treatments were that we had control ones, see there, but we had blocks where we only applied herbicide. We had blocks where we applied herbicide, then we burnt it, then and then we saw what happened. We had blocks where we didn't apply any herbicide, we just burnt it, and we also had blocks where we applied herbicide, burnt it, and then applied herbicide. Okay. So, oops, see if I can get that to go. No, it's not going to go. That's all right. So that's one of the blocks being burnt. And it's a really intense fire. Okay, so what's that look like? That's the control. That's what it looked like with no treatment. This, by the way, is an old sporting field. So in 1978, that was a manicured lawn. If you burnt it, you knocked the lovegrass back, you got rid of a bit of the mass, you got rid of some of that nodding and so on, but it came back pretty thickly, and it'll get back to that pretty soon. If you used weed treatment, so if you used herbicide, you killed the lovegrass, but the lovegrass is still there, and it's still shading all the soil, and you've still got nothing for the colonising species to get through. However, if you use herbicide and then fire, then basically there's virtually no lovegrass, and there's a bunch of other species that have come up there. So you can knock the lovegrass out and get it back, get it out of the equation. Okay, so here, that's weed, fire, weed. and you can see there's very little love grass. There's no love grass in the herbicide only set blocks, but the love grass is still there as a dead thing. And then all the other treatments, there's heaps of love grass. And we did it in 2 separate spots. So here's the control, here's the fire treatment, that's the weed treatment, that's the fire and weed, weed and fire, weed, fire, weed. And you can see that, again, there's virtually no love grass. So it doesn't get rid of the love grass, but it knocks the love grass down to a level where you could then go out the next year and you could go, there's a love grass, I'll just spot spray that. There's a love grass, I'll spot spray that. And you can, if you get good vegetation, healthy vegetation growing, then love grass actually doesn't do that well invading it. So, okay, that's more of the same, just showing that when you integrate herbicides and fire, you make a whole lot of progress that that works that you couldn't do otherwise. And what that means is that you can then say, well, in this landscape, if we're going to do a burn, we need to start thinking about what are we going to do to get the most that we can out of the effect of the burn on the weeds. So you say, do we do a pre-burn spray? Do we do a post-burn follow-up? Okay, so African olive. We tried looking at the same sort of situation with African olive, and we went through and basically cut and painted the African olive. That's really not as easy as you might think, because if you cut that stem of African olive off, you've got about 3 seconds before the plant transport shuts down. So you actually need 2 people. You need someone cutting that off and somebody else coming in and painting it pretty much straight away. Okay, so we cut all these off and we actually heaped the dead African olive around the stumps. And then we did the most intense burn we possibly could. And we successfully wiped out the African olive. Now, African olive is still a major issue, and lantana is a similar issue. And the thing about African olive is it basically, underneath the Cumberland Plain woodland, it looks like a rainforest understory. So what happens is bell miners come in and they set up in the tops of the trees, and then they come down and dive bomb any bird that's in that territory, because they're like thinking, we're in this rainforest and we're protecting it. So you have to, so controlling African olive also means you can control the bell miners and you can get the birds back. Okay, so then other issues, trees. So Tanya did a survey of hollow bearing trees. These are all less than 5 per, let me just see, per hectare, less than 5 hollow bearing trees per hectare. That's Golgua Nature Reserve and Cattai National Park, both of which are relatively undisturbed. But all the rest of it, this is all regrowing Cumberland Plain, and it's nowhere near hollow bearing size. Those trees, most of the trees aren't at the size where they can bear hollows. So it means that, remember I said arboreal mammals was a big thing in the Cumberland Plain, so there's nowhere for them to live. Okay, 1.8% of 8,500 trees had hollows. And why do hollows matter? Well, that gives you an idea of that's how big the trees have to be, somewhere around this size, to have hollows. And you can see how many trees are this size and how few trees are up at hollow bearing age. So if you actually said, I wanted to take the Cumberland Plain and I want to actually try and get arboreal mammals back in the Cumberland Plain, you wouldn't go around looking for those bits of lots and lots of regrowing canopy. You'd actually try and say, where are these trees? And let's build vegetation around that, because that is several hundred years worth of investment, which you're not going to get anywhere else. So substantial time lag trying to do that. Okay, so can you try and do something by putting in artificial hollows, which are bat boxes? So that's a simple bat box. Bat boxes will put in sunny side, shady side, etc. On big trees, on small trees. And this is a really complex bat box, which has chambers, right? So there's internal chambers, external chambers. There's different size entrances. There's basically a whole range of different chambers in there. Now, if you think about a tree hollow, the whole point about a tree hollow is it is a really complex environment. It's a house. And if you think about your house, if it's a hot day, you can go to the cool part of your house. If it's a cold day, you can go and say, oh, I'm going to sit in the sun. So that is just a single environment. And some days that's going to be good and other days it won't. Whereas that is a complex environment. And that's what you actually really need to be doing to get things to work. So in that complex environment, we got bats into these. Did you get bats in those complex environments? But we actually got maternity colonies. And that is really, really unusual. And then my favourite, we had feather-tailed gliders recolonise Skyville. And the first year we surveyed, I think there was about 5. The next year there was about 25. So basically, they're sitting there, they're waiting to come in, but there's no hollows. So you provide the hollows and they go, you beauty, let's try and get in there. Yeah, that was in the complex one, not in the simple one. So if you put the traps in, right, pre-augmentation, that's they're the augmentation spots, they're the control spots, no significant difference at that stage. 6 months post-augmentation, seasonal effect, they're pretty much the same. 18 months after, that's the bat use in the environment that had the extra bat boxes in it. And they're not all necessarily, they're just the simple bat boxes for the most part. So basically the bats are going, you beauty, here we go. And in fact, if you take some of those simple bat boxes, you put them on the wall of your house, bats will find them and they'll start living there. You can actually turn your suburb into a bat habitat. This is a piece of Waianamatta Nature Reserve and no trees. So we invented some trees and put up there. I haven't heard what the outcome of this is yet. I'm not sure whether we've done the more recent survey, but ideally it should be working. Okay, but there is no rats, no antechinus. That's because of a lack of logs, right? And again, the same sort of thing. 100-metre transect, cat-eye gulgua, lots of logs, virtually no logs anywhere else. And or less than 5 in 100 metres. And I thought the ADI site, which has been locked up since the 1940s, I thought, well, there'd be lots of logs in there because Defence Department's been keeping everybody out of it. It's going to be fantastic. So I went in, we went through, no logs. And I said, where are all the logs? Well, every year they invited the RFS in to do their chainsaw courses. And the RFS cut up all the logs and put them on the truck and took them home and burned them. So, yes, best laid plans. So there's no rocks on the Cumberland Plain. So logs are it. Logs are where you hide. It's where you hide from fire. It's where you hide from hot days. It's where you shelter when it's cold. It's where you shelter in the rain. So basically, we've all been out there cutting up firewood and burning it all. And no Rattus fuscipes as a result. So, this video will work. So one of the things we did was we thought, okay, let's try and get some donated logs and let's put them into one of the nature reserves. This is going into Mulgoa Nature Reserve. And you couldn't truck them in there. So we had a helicopter to bring them in. And basically groups of 3 locks spread around. There were some Rattus fuscipes near there. So we are hoping Rattus fuscipes has recolonised that. Okay. This is a bigger one. It says scheduled, but it's actually happened. When one of the suburbs future suburbs or current suburbs in ADI was being developed. We said to the developer, are you cutting down trees? They said, yes. We said, we want every tree, right? There's something like 20,000 tonnes of trees, of logs in there. So we basically did a bunch of surveys, selected some blocks, did a bunch of surveys of those blocks before the logs were added. And now it took some years to get the machinery and the time, but now those logs have been added out into the park. So we've got a bunch of sites. Now, you think about a log is a whole lot of extra carbon that's going into the environment. So it's providing a lot of energy for the microbes and everything else like that, which means that there's a whole lot of energy there for the worms and the invertebrates and so on, which means there's a lot of food there for the lizards and there's a lot of food there for the birds. So it's like the very base of the ecosystem. Okay, so then one of those other barriers is seed bank. How do you actually get, what I guess we found out from all of this is that the real driver in terms of trying to revegetate Cumberland Plain and probably any sort of grassy box woodland is the ground cover. And to give you an idea, there's usually, say, 5 or 6 species of trees in the canopy, if you're lucky. And there's usually maybe 10 or so species of shrubs, if you're lucky. But there's 60 or 70 species of ground cover in a good patch of Cumberland Plain woodland. And not only that, those 60 or 70 species, they won't all be above the ground at one time. Some will come up after fire, some will come up in a wet year, some will come up in summer and disappear in winter, etc. But that's the size of diversity. So when we start going with, we're going to plant trees, we're just dealing with a tiny proportion of the biodiversity. So this is Paul Gibson-Roy, and we worked with Paul Gibson-Roy and funded him to start producing seed of a bunch of Cumberland Plain plants. And he set up a seed production area at the University of Western Sydney. Sadly, that's no longer there, but we were able to basically generate a whole bunch of seed. And then this is a piece of Western Sydney, which University of Western Sydney, which was ploughed. And because of that nutrient issue, one of the issues is, as I said, we can add carbon and get rid of nitrate, but this has been a paddock. So there's far too much phosphate in there for the natives to really enjoy it. So this was scalped. They shaved about that much off the top of the soil. And the natives don't care about that. The exotics do. The exotics have a hard time from it. So, and then this is actually a biscuit making machine. And he converted this biscuit making, these two people converted the biscuit making machine into being a seeder. And the seed is mixed with sand, comes down here, and it gets jiggled into the soil and then rolled. And that's what you get. And, yes, that's not thick, but there's basically, if you tried to put that in as tube stock, there's no way you could afford that. So that's basically hundreds of plants, somewhere around 60, 70 plants per square metre, if you actually go and look at it properly. And they then seed and they then start thickening up. And just see, there's lots and lots of different plants coming up. So we're looking at, one of the things that we were looking at is whether we could then do African lovegrass control and then seeding and doing all of that. So if you're going to try and do conservation in the Cumberland Plain Reserve, you have to be doing active, informed management. You can't just say we're going to put a fence around it and keep the bikes out and the people with the shovels. You have to actually go, this is not in the condition we want. How do we get it there? And you also have to sit there and say, if I was going to set up a Cumberland Plain Reserve system, it wouldn't be where the current reserves are. One of the first things you'd do is you'd say, we need a big corridor of vegetation down Eastern Creek, because that's the high nutrient soils. And the high nutrient soils put out high nutrient leaves. And the high nutrient leaves is what the koalas and the gliders and all those arboreal mammals all live on. So the reserves are in the wrong place, but because most of those places have had a lot of the vegetation altered, we have real problems getting our eyes out of this whole thing of it's got to look like vegetation to go in a reserve. It's, you know, it's vegetation that's just so old, and this is just a blip. What we've done to it at this stage is just a blip, right? If we all died tomorrow of super COVID, given another few hundred years, or monkeypox, I think is a new one, given another few hundred years, a whole lot of those suburbs are going to have vegetation growing up through the houses. You know, it's we got Skyville has a bunch of paddocks, and one of the things was that the paddocks were historic because they were used for farming, training, etc. And so some of the historical archaeologists said to me, well, you need to keep these paddocks as, you know, you need to keep these paddocks as grass. And I said, so are you going to give me the money to do that? Because the basic story is unless you're actively trying to keep the trees out, they're going to come back. Okay, so you've got to do adaptive management. You can't just say, we'll fix it like this. You've got to say, let's try something and see what the results are, and then let's try something else. And you need to do it in chunks. You can't say, let's do the Cumberland Plain. You've got to say, let's do this bit of it and see how that goes. And you've got to involve the community so that they can actually see what's going on. Okay, so this is the polishing pond in the Schoolhouse Creek sewage treatment plant just north of Penrith. Okay, so that's not habitat. However, about 10 years ago, Platypus decided it was. Me and my crew had to spend an afternoon pulling a platypus out of here. The platypus was in the Nepean River. And there is a nice population of platypus in the Nepean River and in Cat-Eye Creek and in South Creek. Anyway, this platypus was in the Nepean River and it could smell, they obviously did a good job with their polishing pond. It could smell the polishing pond and he thought this is a good place. Came all the way up Schoolhouse Creek, quite a hard journey, into this polishing pond. He was happy as Larry. This is the place I need to be. So we go, that's a bit of concrete. He goes, that's habitat. Okay, so don't go thinking that because something looks like it's buggered, that the animals and the biodiversity think it's buggered. There's a thing called the eastern barred bandicoot, which was considered to be extinct on the Australian mainland. You can see it places like Mount Field in Tasmania. Okay, it was rediscovered back in the 1980s, and it was rediscovered in, I think it's Horsham in Victoria, in the tip, right? So the big problem with the bandicoot was dogs and cats, and the tip had this tip was a pretty slack tip. So it had so many car bodies and old fridges and old washing machines and old lounges and so on, that it was this complex environment like it might have had with logs. So they could escape the cats and dogs. Okay, so the landscape, as I said, hundreds of millions of years old, and they've recovered from massive disturbance before. And the native species aren't sitting there saying, oh, this isn't beautiful. You know, a lot of conservation, a lot of the time you get arguments about this rainforest is beautiful. You know, this tree over here is beautiful, etc. Animals don't care. They just go, can I sleep? Can I eat? Can I hide from a predator? Can I breed? You know, and it doesn't matter whether it's ugly or great. And community can really make a difference to that. So this is a koala. This koala is on the Cumberland Plain side of the Nepean River. It came out of the Blue Mountains and swam across the Nepean River to come up into the crappy Cumberland Plain vegetation, because the Cumberland Plain is the koala habitat. The koalas that are in the Blue Mountains and around Georges River, around the sandstone around there, they are a remnant population living on the edge of their habitat, and their primary habitat is the higher fertility soil of the Cumberland Plain. And in fact, the Campbelltown population, the females actually live in a bunch of urban parks within the Campbelltown suburb because that's where there's enough nutrition for them. And that's, you might think, oh, that's horrific. But as far as that echidna was concerned, that was the best place he could possibly hide. It's not a log, but it works as well. And it was bloody hard getting him out of there, I tell you. Okay, so our great-great-great-grandfathers saw the Cumberland Plain in all its glory. Not that they knew what they were looking at. And maybe if we work at it properly and think about the long term, our great-grandchildren will be able to see something of what the Cumberland Plain should look like. And I think that's it. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Any questions for Jono? Matt?
Yeah, I may have missed something before, but you were talking about sandstone having a 7-year period between fires.
Minimum. Yeah.
What Cumberland Plain?
Oh, when we did the research on the Cumberland Plain, we actually ended up finding that the Cumberland Plain probably did best if it actually had somewhere around 2 or 3 years between fires. Not really ripping fires, but 2 or 3 years between fires. When Penny Watson did her work on the Cumberland Plain to find the condition of remnants with regard to fire, the best remnant was behind a high school down near St Mary's, where basically the kids from the high school regularly went over the back fence and dropped ciggies or even lit the bush up. And so it had actually been frequently burnt, and that was actually in the best condition. And one of your issues with all of this, of course, is that you have to have, the manpower and the organisation to actually do the burn. And then the other side of it is we to do a really good proper burn in the Cumberland Plain ecologically, we were trying to burn on a day that was like 29, 30 degrees and maybe about 30% or less humidity, and preferably with about 5 to 10 kilometres at least of wind, right? And under those circumstances, you just wouldn't go near the sandstone with a torch. Yep.
Gary.
John, I noticed it really scientifically oriented, the way you designed it.
Sure.
Perhaps.
Yep.
The scientists are driving, you want to make sure you're asking the right questions and doing the right planning. At what stage of these major projects do you actually involve, really involve, community? Does it wait until you need hands on deck to plant the trees, or do you involve?
No, okay. So give you a couple of examples. The olive work we did, that was done with the Skyville Community Group, and the Skyville Community Group, in fact, initiated it. So there was, we had a major fire on a blow-up day. We had an arsonist who used to travel from the Blue Mountains to the Central Coast every Friday, and he used to come by for morning tea and light up Skyville. And one day he hit it on just before the fire season started. It was a really blow-up day, and the local fire brigade was away in Victoria winning the national RFS championships. So as a result of that, a couple of houses got lost, and people from Skyville, there was a bunch of people saying, this is all your fault, etc., etc. But there were also a bunch of community people who said, what can we do? How can we help? And they decided that what they wanted to do was get rid of the olives. So we turned that into a trial. And when you say the scientists were involved, it was actually mostly me and my staff doing that with a bit of help from scientists. Similarly, the lovegrass stuff, we had Murrumbidgee, a local Aboriginal group, was involved in a lot of that, and they did a lot of the work. And again, we had the Skyville Community Group, and we had the Nature Conservation Council. So we had a bunch of community groups as partners. Yeah, but I agree, it's really important.
In conservation group that I belong to, you're contacting the public servants and the national parks people, so we can spread this amongst our people to offer help.
Yep.
It's amazing the number of times that we just don't get a really considered response.
Yeah, well, sometimes that will have to do with the individuals and their capacity. Sometimes it will have to do with the difficulties of actually doing that, because, for example, if we wanted to take a community group and say, let's go out and do this, we have to do a whole lot of safety analyses. We have to do a whole lot of briefings. We have to do a whole bunch of things like that. Now, I think that's very, very worthwhile. But if you've got somebody who's like in a really, really busy park like Royal, and they're trying to do something like that, then they might have capacity to do a bit of that, but not have capacity to do a lot of it.
Could I just ask, Jono, the time length over from beginning to end of
that was probably about 15 years of work. So it's basically that's basically the questions that I started at Skyville in 2001, and then from 2001 to about 2002. By 2002, we started going, gee, we don't know what we're doing here. How do we find that out? And so then we started asking questions. And once we asked some questions, got some answers, we went, well, here's some other questions we need to ask. And Professor Charles Morris from the University of Western Sydney, he was a really willing partner in all of that. So, you know, we talked about it and said, well, how can we do something further? And we looked at it, and we talked with community groups, and we talked with everyone about that, and came up with the next step and the next step. One of the things that we were looking at that we were going to do was to look at doing a burn and then adding carbon, but adding carbon as eucalypt wood chips, because that's a slow release thing, and it actually establishes a litter on the ground and has a chance of establishing a really good soil microbiome underneath it, which is much more sympathetic to the native species. And that'll go a certain distance, but for example, ground orchids will not grow without their commensal fungi and mycorrhiza. And if they don't have those mycorrhiza, they can't grow. So if the ground orchids have been wiped out, if that mycorrhiza isn't there, then you can't go, let's just put ground orchids back in this environment. Yep.
I know you've got all this work. How can it be applied? Where has it been applied?
Well, it's been applied. We have done a bunch of places on a small scale where we've, so there's an old airstrip, Second World War airstrip in Western Sydney Regional Park, or the Western Sydney Parklands, which has been cleared and scalped and re-sown. And that's now, I haven't seen it for a year or two, but that's now basically a Cumberland Plain ground cover. We've got some smaller areas. I've got an Australian Rules Oval in Skyville, which I've similarly turned into half of it into Cumberland Plain ground cover. One of the really big issues is actually getting the seed, and one of the really big issues with getting the seed is actually getting people to get away from, and when I say people, I don't mean your group, I mean the people like Greening Australia and, you know, the big funding bodies, getting away from this idea of it's all about tube stock. You know, it's all about trees and it's all about tube stock. And trees and tube stock is great, and it will make a big difference and it will help. But if you're really going to try and get this vegetation actually reconstructed and functioning, then there's a huge amount of effort has to go into ground cover. So my hope and ambition is that we can re-establish seed production. There's some seed production going on in places like Victoria. And when I was working as a farmer, there are a bunch of people who are doing seed production for farms to say, instead of just sowing oats or whatever, how about you sow a whole range of species, and it makes a massive difference to the soil. And some people are doing that with natives.
You wanting to get away?
I'm okay.
Yeah, okay. Adrian?
Jono, just following up on that last comment, a number of us are working with the Greater Sydney Land Care, and mentioned that there's a tree canopy target for all of Sydney, and Greater Sydney Land Care actually provide tube stock to grow canopy trees.
Yep.
Could you just add to the comment you made previously, they are putting these tube stock in, which are going to be 3 metre trees or more. But you've just said, hey guys, you should be putting in ground cover.
It's the tube stock will help, and the tube stock will give you some habitat. So the tube stock will give you some increased habitat. You know, in 80 years' time, you're going to have a bunch of hollows. You're going to start to get a bunch of hollows. In sort of 50 or 60 years' time, or maybe even a bit earlier than that, maybe 30 years' time, you'll have koala feeding habitat, etc. But you're not, if you just have trees and you don't have shrubs, then what you're doing is you're making noisy miner habitat. So you're not going to have woodland birds. And in fact, one of the issues that happened while I was doing all this, Homebush Bay is part of the Cumberland Plain. Homebush Bay had a huge number of, and there's actually a really nice remnant in the nature reserve, Silverwater Nature Reserve. And Homebush Bay, that was some really good plantings of trees and shrubs and so on. And then probably 15 years after the Olympics, because they were all sort of planted 5 years before the Olympics, 15 years after the Olympics, all the shrubs started falling over. And then all the woodland birds started disappearing, because once you've got a canopy and then nothing but bare ground underneath it, that's bell miner country. Whereas if you've got lots of little shrubs and complexity, that's where the wrens and the robins and all of those things come in.
We've got to go back and get you to talk to the Greater Sydney Land Care.
Matt?
Thank you.
Quick comment on what you said. Another question about equity. Like you mentioned, it's a target thing. And
You want to stand up? Stand up. Project yours.
Just it didn't start. You often will start with 3 because they take a long time. So that's important. So my question was about Western Sydney Airport. Is there any Cumberland related revegetation going on within the bounds of the airport? And if not, what sort of offsets?
So there was going to be. We lobbied very hard, and myself and a number of people lobbied very hard to get a major ground cover seed production operation going. And the idea was that instead of having lawn around the airport, it would actually be Cumberland Plain ground cover. So, and as far as I know, I'm not sure whether that's still going. I think it may have bitten the dust, because I think some senior executives said, "Oh, this looks like a lot of money." Well, no, it wasn't too hard, because that seed production facility you saw was just simply a case of reproducing that. So all the expertise was there and so on. But I suspect the money's gone somewhere else.
One of which was small acreage farm.
Yeah. Absolutely. And there was a lot of opportunity to, I mean, like I said, that picture I showed you was an old airstrip. So there's a lot of opportunity to do something like that across part of the Cumberland Plain, across a bit of the airport area. And it means you then wouldn't be mowing. You then wouldn't, you have a whole different well, that's right, possibly. Suppose you could get plains wanderers and have all sorts of problems. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, goats don't do love grass. Goats, I didn't talk about blackberry. We did the same sort of thing with blackberry, herbicide and burning, and that does work. Herbicide works really well, but it's blackberries little patches here and there, so it can be quite hard. If you use only herbicide on blackberry, it's really, really tough, because blackberry's got a huge root system which is full of energy, and then it's just got these canes sticking up above the ground. So you poison the canes, and then it shuts off the transport and preserves the root system, and then puts up more canes. And you come back and you poison it, and you come back and you poison it, come back and poison it, and in 1 month, your weed man's sick, or you've gone called away to a fire or whatever, and it goes bang, and up it comes and regenerates everything, and you're gone. So goats are a great way to do that. So you can actually, there's people down the south coast who have goats that they hire out, and they will, there's animal welfare issues. You've got to have a shed, you've got to have water, you've got to have alternative feed, but you basically tether them in a blackberry patch, and they chew the blackberry patch down to nothing. And then, sorry? Oh, because lovegrass is terrible, terrible feed. It's got nothing in it, no nutrients at all. And then it's actually a major problem. It's going west. It's going, it's going across into the farming landscapes of Australia, and we are not paying attention to it in the way we should. So yes, so they do this thing, and you put the goat in there, and it chews it right down to nothing. And then when it's done that, when it resprouts, as soon as it resprouts, you hit it with the herbicide. And at that stage, it's got no energy left. So you actually have a good chance of killing it.
Okay, I think we better start wrapping it up.
No worries.
I'll just call on Janine to offer a vote of thanks on behalf of Oatley Floor and Fauna.
On behalf of the group,
Oh, thank you.
we really appreciate your talk tonight. It's given us a lot to think about.
Oh, great.
I think a lot of us have been involved in planting expeditions for various people around the countryside. The fact that we're doing something.
Oh, it's great. It's a really important
great.
thing to do. I plant trees.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we've been out there and helped him plant trees on his property.
Yeah.
In fact, on the Balubala.
Yep.
I got it right that time, but it's been a while. Every time I go out there, I have to correct my pronunciation. So again, thank you very much for what you've presented us with tonight.
Yeah.
The study and the extent of your research has been wonderful.
Great.
The use of fire, and I have never heard of the herbicide fire regime, which is a very interesting concept to us to consider.
Mm-hmm.
And on behalf of the group, we'd like to present
Oh,
you
fantastic.
a memento of our little area called Oatley.
Yep.
And I hope you enjoy the.
Oh, no, I had a quick look at this when it was on the table. I thought that'd be great.
I noticed.
Can I just tell you something? When I was working in national parks back in the probably the end of the 1980s, we were going through all sorts of problems as an organisation. We had all sorts of ne'er-do-wells in charge, and one of them decided with their wonderful offsiders who they had no contact with all the people in national parks, but they decided we needed to be G'd up, our morale fixed. So we got all these stickers, and we were all given a sticker that said, remember, National Parks is the oldest conservation organisation in Australia, right? And some of the stickers ended up on the walls of urinals. But one of the great things was someone pointed out and said, no, Oatley Flora and Fauna Society is the oldest conservation society in Australia.